home with a vodka. That's my medicine, that's my night nurse. But I really appreciate you coming. I know it's like the hottest day of the year, or certainly feels like it. So I really, really appreciate you guys coming. And I hope you like it. This is slightly different, I suppose, talk for me. I'm not really one to get political or whatnot. And of course, I was going to do this talk in July, ahead of the general election, but obviously that didn't happen, my talk. You may have noticed the general election happened. So tonight's talk, it took me ages to come up with the title, so it's not very snappy. What was it? Politics, voting, and the Oldham ladies who led the way. I started out to do it about Annie Kenning, who is just absolutely fascinating. And I don't know, spoiler alert, she was one of 11 children, and so many of her sisters fought the suffrage movement as well. And so I'm sharing their stories, and I found lots of other ladies in Oldham who really worked so hard to further, women's suffrage. But then there was just so much else about politics, and I just thought, as I always think, it's my talk. So I'm putting it all in, the title can take care of itself. So Annie Kenning does really, she is the main focus, but there are lots of other bits and pieces, and I do hope you enjoy it. So this is Annie Kenning here, and this is Christabel Pankhurst. So Christabel and her mum, I do mention them in this talk, but as always it's an Oldham focus. They were Manchester, and I think enough has been said and written about the wonderful Pankhurst, so I did want to concentrate on the Oldham ladies, but I like that. So yeah, we've got Annie there, Christabel there. But I don't have my fancy clicker tonight, not my fault. My husband borrowed it, gave me the clicker back, but not the technical bit that makes it click. I don't talk tech. So we're going back to...
Press the ball.
Yeah, I'm going to press the button. That's what I'm going to be doing tonight, Roy. So tonight's agenda, a very brief overview of voting in Great Britain. And Watton boroughs, I couldn't find any way to really shoehorn them in, but I liked the term, I liked the idea, I like what Watton boroughs are, so I'm telling you about them. All right? It kind of fits in vaguely. A little bit how voting happened in this country and worldwide, from show of hands to secret ballots, important Oldham ladies, why we vote on Thursdays. Because funny enough, because I talked to my friends and colleagues at work about, these talks, and I mentioned that, about this, and that was a question a few people asked me, why do we vote on Thursdays? So I thought, let's include that. Which countries let women vote first, and then some, I'm going to finish with literally just a couple of female political firsts. Okay, so I won't be coming back to that for a little while. So, starting with a very brief overview of voting in Great Britain. Voting could sustain, a 16-week series of talks in itself. So, as always, I've just had to grab what I found particularly interesting, just to give a flavour of what it was like in Great Britain before universal suffrage, before everybody was eligible to vote. So I think we'll probably be aware that prior to universal suffrage, voting was very much in the hands of the men who ruled everything and decided everything. So from 1429, men over 21 who owned freehold lands or tenement lands with an annual net income of 40 shillings or more were eligible to vote. So not very many, frankly. And the first British general election was held in 1708, following the Acts of Union in 1706 and 1707, which joined the English and Scottish parliaments. So previously you had the Kingdom in England, you had the Kingdom of Scotland, and they did their own things politically. They had their own parliaments, their own voting arrangements. The kingdoms had been joined since 1603 by the same monarch, but it took 100 years or so to get the political side sorted out. So in this very first British general election, it was men with the income, with the landowning status, who would have been able to vote. Then we had to wait till 1832 when we had the Reform Act, and that's opened up the voting to more men. Now, if they owned lands, freehold or tenement lands worth £2 or over, or if they rented property to that value, they could vote over the age of 21. So for the first time, you didn't have to be a landowner, you could be a tenant and still vote. And as a result of the 1832 Act, about 1 in every 7 men in Great Britain was now eligible to vote. Still no ladies. So you had the 1869 Municipal Franchise Act, and that allowed unmarried female ratepayers to vote in local elections in towns and cities. And in 1882, this was extended to married women. The reason why married women had to wait was because prior to 1882, married women had no legally recognised separate identity. They belonged to their husbands. They could not own property in their own right, so they would not be eligible to vote. But the 1882 Married Women's Property Act allowed women to control and own property in their own right, allowing them to be freer of the husband, so they were now allowed to vote in local elections in towns and cities. And then the 1888 County Council Act allowed female ratepayers to be able to vote in local county and borough elections. And the 1907 Qualification of Women Act allowed women to stand for election for the first time as members of local county and city councils. So many men, and some women disapproved of all this shenanigans, letting women have a bit more of a say. But they were small steps forward for women's votes. But by the early 20th century, there was still one glaring gap. So we may have had the right then to vote in local elections and then to stand in local elections. Women still didn't have the right to vote and stand in elections to Parliament for the overall running of the country. And I will come on to the women, local ladies, who did so much to rectify this. So before I get to that, as I said, I just wanted to talk about rotten boroughs because I think they're brilliant, okay? So, a term a lot of us have heard of, or are we familiar with the term?
No.
No? Good, because if you'd all said Jess Kelly, we know exactly what they are, I might have had to skip this bit and I'd have cried inside, okay?
I just saw the Blackadder, the first one ever done.
Oh, Blackadder, yes! It's got a very Blackadder ring about it actually, hasn't it?
That was the one where Vincent Hanna played his own great-great-grandfather.
Oh, right!
And,
Right, make note of that. Bit of Blackadder action. Very historically correct. So basically, a rotten borough. So a rotten borough was a parliamentary borough with a very small number of voters. So the choice of MP being sent to Parliament from that borough was usually in the hands of the one family or one person, okay? And it was open to abuse, hence the term rotten. Particularly, and when you realise that until 1872, voting at elections was done through a public show of hands at a polling station. So if you're in a massive town square and you're like, right, he's not looking, I'm going to vote for who I want and not who I've been told to vote for, because so many people were told who they're going to vote for. But if you're standing there and it's just you and a cow, you know, they're going to notice who you're voting for. So you would be, you know, very brave to vote otherwise. So it did put that political power in a very small number of people. So the most famous of rotten boroughs, and the one that prompted things to be cleaned up, was Old Sarum. So, honestly, it's such a British thing to have happened. I love it. So, historically, towns were given this royal charter that allowed it to send 2 MPs to the House of Commons. Crucially, these charters were not amended, so a town could grow in size or decrease in size, but they still sent those 2, okay? So they could be very disproportionately represented. So Manchester had a population of 90,000 people at the beginning of the 19th century, didn't have a charter. So Manchester wasn't represented in Parliament. It was under the much larger borough of Lancashire. And the opposite happened in a place called Old Sarum, which had a really declining population. So it was the original site of the city of Salisbury. Thank you. My brain's not working. So Salisbury, the original site, Old Sarum, had a castle, cathedral, town walls, and a really thriving population. But in the 1220s, basically the cathedral said, not happy. We don't like the site, we don't like living next door to the castle, we don't get on very well with them, so they have to move. They literally went and built a new cathedral 2 miles away at the site, which is now Salisbury. And this kind of started the decline of Old Sarum as a town, because more and more people just kind of followed the cathedral, they followed and settled in Salisbury. The castle hung on until the 15th century as a kind of administration centre. By the 1540s, that had all but disappeared. So, when Old Sarum had been thriving with its cathedral, its castle, its many, many people who lived there, it had a charter to send 2 people to the House of Commons. And it was never revoked. So by the 17th century, there were no resident voters in Old Sarum. But landowners in the town who lived elsewhere, this loophole in the law, they were able to vote. And so we've got a parliamentary constitution. It was basically populated by sheep. There were no resident voters, and they were sending 2 MPs to Parliament. So, rotten borough. So the Reform Act of 1832 established the principle that representation should follow population, and granted seats to cities that had grown, such as Manchester, such as Birmingham, you know, these booming cities that had thrived in the Industrial Revolution, and took seats away from rotten boroughs. So the sheep were like, well, fine, no more voting for us. So how voting happened from show of hands to secret ballots. So, yeah, I mentioned that until 1874, you put your hands up, and that's how you voted in elections. When you voted, have you ever noticed that your ballot paper has numbers on it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And this in theory means that you can have your votes identified.
Yeah.
Okay. But that would only ever be the case if there was a suspicion of voter fraud. Okay. And it would have to be a really big, like someone's come out and said, yes, I committed voter fraud, you know, for them to do that.
The voting communists used to form one got National Front or what?
Is that what the communists used to do?
Yes.
Interestingly, so the use of ballot papers, I didn't know this, is known as the Australian ballot, because Victoria and South Australia, they were the first places to introduce secrecy of the ballot in 1856. Interestingly, Australia is one of about 21 countries worldwide that makes voting compulsory. I didn't actually know any countries did that. If you don't vote in Australia, you have to have a bloody, good, that's my Australian accent, a bloody good reason. Yeah, it's not funny. You have to have a rather good reason as to why, or you're fined. I think it's 250 Australian dollars. They introduced compulsory voting in Australia in 1924. Prior to this, voting turnout had been between 50 and 75%, roughly. And following the introduction of compulsory voting, it increased. And in 2022, the voting turnout was 89%. In Singapore, voting is also compulsory. You don't get fined, you just get removed from the electoral roll. I like that. Well, you can use it, but taking it away from you then. There we go, sucks to be you. I mean, I assume you can earn it back, I presume. Ancient Greece, you know, I like to go right back, appears to have had the earliest known form of voting for political leaders, but they did it in kind of a reverse way, in a negative way. They voted for those they least wanted to see in power, and if you received more than a certain number of votes, you had to go into exile for 10 years. So it wasn't just enough that like they really don't like my policies, all right, I'll stand down, no, I'm off. You had to go into exile for 10 years. It probably didn't happen very often. I mean, the voting took place every year, but you did have, the voting pool was small. Male landowners, they were the only ones that can vote, and to be exiled you had to get over 6,000 votes. So you'd probably have to be really unpopular to get voted into exile. And in Sparta, an ancient Greek city-state, they had a shouting election. So your candidates would, you know, walk around the room, and everyone would clap and cheer, and you had judges in an adjoining room who, after everyone had done their bit, they would judge who'd had the loudest, most enthusiastic support. I like that one. I'm not a fan of the show of hands, but I do like the give it up for Kelly. So, yes. Okay, so moving on. Important Oldham ladies. So this is the main part of tonight's talk. These are the women who did their bit in Oldham to further women's suffrage. Okay, so move back here. So I'm going to start with a lady called Lydia Becker. Anyone heard of her?
No.
No? So this is why I do these talks. She was born in 1827, the oldest of 15 children, I know, in a middle-class family, who lived at Fox Denton Hall in Chadderton. This is Fox Denton Hall. Now it's currently owned by and in the care of Oldham Council, and despite it being a Grade 2 star listed building, it's falling into disrepair. It's vacant, it's basically falling apart. And I've not found any plans for them to do anything with it, which is a shame, because it's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. But Lydia, lovely Lydia, she was fascinating. She was, do you know, like that insulting words for certain types of women in the 19th century, blue stockings. You know, like an educated lady who wasn't afraid to show her knowledge. Well, she was fascinated by science, particularly botany, and Lydia corresponded with Charles Darwin and helped him with some of his research. She regularly contributed to his scientific work, and she was recognised for her own. In fact, let's get rid of Fox then. So there we go, Lydia. She was recognised in her lifetime for her scientific contributions, and she won national awards for the work that she produced. And she was also heavily involved in women's suffrage. So there was no Oldham Women's Suffrage Society during her lifetime. So she did work in Manchester, involved with the Manchester Women's Suffrage movement. In 1867, a female Manchester shopkeeper called Lily Maxwell was accidentally included on a register of voters in Manchester, allowing her legally to vote in a Manchester by-election. Before it was law that women could do this. So Lydia went with Lily to Chawton Town Hall to make sure she was allowed to vote, and she was. The voting officer allowed her to vote because she was down on the list. And so as a result, Lydia immediately started encouraging other women, female heads of households in Manchester, to get their names added to electoral rolls to apply for it. And once again, men were upset. So they declared that illegal the following year. We firmly put a stop to that nonsense. And in 1868, Lydia was one of 3 speakers at the first public meeting of the National Society for Women's Suffrage at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, and she moved the motion that women should have equal voting rights to men. And she toured northern cities on behalf of the society, and in 1870 she co-founded the Women's Suffrage Journal, which was a magazine that focused on women's issues and support for women's suffrage. And, you know, obviously wrote lots of things, but they regularly published guidance on how to prepare a petition demanding women's suffrage to be submitted in the House of Commons. You know, I'd like to see stuff like that being floated about now. And the journal ran until her death in 1890. She's slightly different from some suffragettes in that she obviously wanted female votes, but she wanted them for unmarried women. So as we saw at the beginning of this talk, married women kind of weren't seen as necessarily independent of their husbands, but she also felt that actually if you had a husband at this time, you had a lot more protection and rights that came from having a husband. You had more security than unmarried women. So she really was concentrating on getting the vote for widows or single women, and it did make her a bit unpopular with other ladies who were fighting the cause, but she did do an awful lot of work for equality between men and women when it came to having the vote. And then we move on to...
Kelly, can I just interrupt? I don't know if you know this or not. If you drive on Broadway, out of town, there's a fairly new road on the left which takes you down to Fox Denton Hall.
Oh, does it?
And there's Lydia Becker Road. I drove down it 2 days ago and thought, I wonder who she was, and now you've told me.
You are kidding me. That's really, I love that stuff. Love it. So you drove down Lydia Becker Way, and you thought, who is she?
Oh no.
See, well, stop going on holiday and missing the talk. Who knows what else? Who knows what else you've missed out on?
Foxgate to go, and you go along Foxgate to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I thought you were about to point out, I don't know if you know,
Yeah.
you've made loads of mistakes. I was like, oh God, I'm sweating. I'm going to go down and have a look. Thank you for that. Okay, so we have Dame Sarah Lees. So, she was born in Manchester in 1842, but don't worry, there's an Oldham connection. Have you clocked the surname? Yes, my nemesis. So she married Charles Edward Lees in 1874 and they moved to Werneth Park. And yes, obviously Charles was one of those Lees. Now, when I just was researching, and I did think, oh, should I do a deep dive and find the connection? But then I lost the will to live, and so I didn't. But it's on my list. This Charles Lees is on my list. That's called something like historical research to do when I have a spare life, kind of thing. But I will try and do a deep dive into that. So she was widowed at the age of 42 and left a very wealthy lady. Very wealthy. So she and her two daughters were left £890,000 between them. So I used 3 separate websites to check, double check and triple check roughly what that's worth in today's money. I'm glad you're sitting there. Very conservative estimates of what that's worth in today's money is about £100 million. And I checked that 3 times. In fact, I've lowered it because I thought if I say anything higher, you'll be like, whatever, Kelly, and you'll walk out. My credibility will be gone. But it's about £100 million. Yeah. So I'd have gone on a cruise around the world for the rest of my life, but you know, she's a better woman than me. And she immediately wanted to put it to good use, and she was heavily involved in so many causes in Oldham. Recreational grounds, Oldham Hospital, education, that was a massive thing that she was involved in. And she was a keen supporter for women's suffrage. She very firmly opposed the violent measures that many suffragettes, particularly later on, would use. However, you know, she still was very committed to the cause. So following the Qualification of Women's Act of 1907, which gave widows and unmarried women the right to stand for local government, she became the first woman elected to Oldham's Town Council, and in 1910 she became the first female mayor of Oldham. She was only the second female mayor in the UK. So the first female mayor was a lady called Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who's actually quite famous for various reasons. So Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, she was the first female mayor in the UK. She was the first female doctor, the first female surgeon, the first female magistrate in the UK. So there's a lot of firsts ticked off there. But she lived down south, London way, so I won't be doing a talk on her, but I had to shoehorn her in somehow. But yes, back to Sarah. So in addition to her own achievement, she was the mother of Marjorie Lees, who I'm going to come on to next. But she was clearly a lady who just got on with things, because when she was mayor, there was a tram strike in Oldham, and it was resolved. But one of the issues has been about like the routes and the times and whatnot. So she was like, fine. She got into the cab of the tram and she drove it herself all along the route to make sure, is it efficient? Is it in the right places? Is it in the right times? She just got on with it, and I think she is wonderful. She could have done a Kelly and just cruised for the rest of her life, but she said, no, I'm not doing that. So well done, Sarah. Okay, so Marjorie. This is Marjorie Lees, her daughter. Okay. So she was born in 1878, and she followed very much in her mother's footsteps. Very active in local politics, and very active in the women's suffrage movement. So in 1919, her mum Sarah stepped down from Oldham Council, and Marjorie was elected to the same seat, and she served until 1934. She was also a philanthropist, used the money that she'd inherited for good causes in Oldham, and they donated Werneth Park family home to Oldham. And when Sarah was mayor, Marjorie was her mayoress, which I thought was rather nice. So the Oldham Women's Suffrage Society was formed in 1910, and Marjorie was elected president, and Mum Sarah was very much involved. She was secretary, I think. And so the society was founded to work towards achieving equal voting rights for women by peaceful and legal means, petitions to the government, meetings, marches. So this is one of their processions. through Oldham in 1912. This is the Society's banner, Oldham Women's Suffrage Society. And here we've got a couple of photos showing members. So this is Marjorie here. We've got this photo here, and that's Marjorie in the middle there. So these are members of the Oldham Women's Suffrage Society. We're going to move on now to Annie Kay. Love Annie Kay. I've got an amazing photo, can't wait to get to it. This is Annie. Okay. And she shares the same birthday as me. A little bit older. Almost 100 years older than me. But yeah, she shares the same birthday. The only famous person I knew was Roald Dahl. He shares my birthday. Everyone else gets really cool people. Not that Roald Dahl's not cool, but you know, I have a really cool person, so I'm very excited about that. She was one of 11 children, born and grew up in Spring Heads. At the age of 10, she went to work in a cotton mill, and you might remember from my cotton mills talk how dangerous they were in general, but particularly for children who were working underneath the machinery. And she actually lost a finger when she worked at the mill. It was ripped off by a moving part of machinery, and she went full-time at the mill at the age of 13. So when she was 26 in 1905, she heard Christabel Pankhurst talk at an independent Labour Party meeting in Manchester, and immediately inspired. She became a member of the women's suffrage movement. She met Christabel's mum, Emily, shortly after, and she had a big impact on Annie. So she started collecting leaflets on women's suffrage and handing them out at the mills to the girls who worked in the mills. And throughout her suffragette career, this lady was arrested 13 times. She weren't messing. She was not messing. And she wasn't content to just hand out leaflets. She became involved in women's suffrage in 1905. And in October that year, she was arrested for the first time. So she and Christabel attended a protest rally at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. Winston Churchill was one of the speakers for the Liberal Party. And Annie interrupted the meeting. She was repeatedly asking if the Liberal government would give women the vote. They were removed, Annie and Christabel, from the meeting. And due to their behaviour, including kicking and spitting at policemen, they were arrested and they were sentenced to 3 days in Strangeways because they refused to pay a fine of 5 shillings. So, I just love this photo. She was arrested 13 times. Now, I don't know which arrest this is. I've got a photo of Annie being arrested. Just look at her face.
No regrets.
Whatsoever.
Yeah.
You know, honestly, that's one of the first photos I came across when I was doing my research, and I thought, I like you, I like you. You know, she just didn't care. She was doing what she felt needed to be done. And in June 1906, she was again arrested for activism. She dressed as a mill girl, and she went with a group of women to the home of Herbert Asquith, Chancellor of the Exchequer, future Prime Minister, and she basically just kept ringing the doorbell. Just kept ringing the doorbell. And so she was arrested. And she was given a choice. She could have a prison sentence or stop campaigning for 12 months. What do you reckon she chose?
The president.
Yep, 2 months in Holloway prison. 1912, she moved into a fairly senior position of the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. She became its deputy. So Christabel Pankhurst at this time had actually moved to France because there was an arrest warrant out for her. So she went to France to avoid that. And Annie travelled to Paris weekly to receive orders from Christabel, mostly in disguise. In 1913, she was charged with incitement to riots and sentenced to 18 months in Maidstone prison. She kept doing a tour of all the prisons. Now, Annie went on hunger strike and became the first suffragette to be released under the Cat and Mouse Act. I don't know if you've heard of that. But basically, that was the suffragette's nickname for the Prisoner's Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act of 1913. Basically allowed, if a prisoner became ill, especially from hunger strike or forced feeding, they're released on licence until they get better, and then they would go back to prison to finish their term. And it was not for compassionate reasons, it's because the prisons didn't want people dying and having to deal with the paperwork, no doubt, that came with that. So Annie fell foul of that act very frequently, and she was awarded the Hunger Strike Medal for Valour. by the WSPU. So they gave her a medal for a hunger strike. But good for them, because it was a very unpleasant thing. The forced feeding was awful. Caused many very serious injuries to the ladies. So, in 1914, with the outbreak of World War I, many prisoners, including suffragettes, were released. So Christabel Pankhurst said, right, fine, now we must fight for our country as we fought for the vote. And many suffragettes, including Annie, were like, well, yeah, you can tell me what to do when it comes to women's suffrage, but you're not telling me what to do when there's a world war, all right? So because activity for women's vote was suspended, Annie went to America, took herself off to America, did a lecture tour. Then she came back to England and gave talks to women, she encouraging them to become munitions workers. And in 1915, the WSPU sent Annie to Australia, where she helped the Prime Minister in a referendum campaign on conscription. I mean, she was better travelled than so many people 100 years later. And then when she came back to England again, she was helping the recruitment of women to munitions factories for the remainder of the war. After the war, and women obtaining the vote, Annie she retired from political life. She married, had a son, lived in Letchworth in Hertfordshire. She wrote a memoir about her time as a suffragette, which was published in 1924, but overall she just shied away from really, she didn't give interviews, she didn't talk to historians, she just kind of married, son, house, retired, not interested really in going over it. And she died in 1953. So she really was a remarkable woman, you know, and rightly we have this statue in Oldham to commemorate our fabulous Annie Kenney. But she wasn't the only Kenney sister. I'd never heard of anyone other than Annie Kenney. But when I was doing the research, I came across a lot of Kenney sisters. So we have Jessie. She was born in 1887. She was 8 years younger than Annie. She was the 9th of these 11 children in the household. She was able to stay in education longer because there were so many older siblings working and contributing to the household finances. So she was able to stay in school until she was 13. And she went with Annie to that 1905 meeting where they heard Christabel Pankhurst. She was interested. She wasn't as immediately, I think, caught and afire with this, but she was interested. She did go on to work with the WSPU, and the following year she became a secretary in the WSPU, and her duties included arranging meetings, publicity stunts, and interruptions of cabinet ministers' meetings. I could do that job. And in June 1908, she was arrested for taking part in a demonstration in London and sentenced to 1 month in prison. So her most notorious activity and arrest came in September 1909. So now Prime Minister Harold Asquith, he refused to meet with the WSPU. He was not prepared to discuss votes for women. So Jessie and a few others, they were frustrated. So they basically, well, if you won't meet with us, we're going to come to you. Okay? And in September 1909, Asquith was staying at the home of his Home Secretary, Herbert Gladstone. When I say home, it was a castle. It was saying, don't just come to the family castle for the weekend, shall we? Yes, let's do that. So Jessie and these other ladies knew that's where he was going to be, so they followed him as he left church on the Sunday morning. There was a slight struggle. Asquith's hat fell off. Gladstone apparently elbowed Jessie quite sharply in the chest, but the gentlemen were able to get away. They got away from these suffragettes. And of course the suffragettes were arrested, convicted of assault on Asquith and Gladstone, and they got prison time at Holloway. But they were given a hero's reception when they were released. And it wasn't just Annie who was quite the traveller. So during the war, WSPU activity suspended. Jessie travelled with Emmeline Pankhurst to Russia to try and persuade the politicians to support the Allied cause. Apparently received short shrift from the male politicians, but the female leaders were actually quite interested in listening. And then after the war, Jessie lived with Annie and her brother-in-law in Letchworth. So she had qualified after the war as a wireless operator, but at this time, you could only be a wireless operator if you were a man. So she was allowed to qualify, but she couldn't get a job. So she worked as a stewardess on various UK shipping lines, and she died in 1985. We also have Caroline. Kenny, known as Kitty. So this is Caroline. She was born in 1880. So her sister, and they're all known as something else, Jane, was known as Jenny. And this is the only photo I can find of Jenny. It's not a very good one. But that's Kitty and Jenny in the background there. So they ran a recovery centre for suffragettes who'd been released from prison under this Cat and Mouse Act. And it was known as Tower Cressy, and it was in Kensington. For suffragettes who'd been released from the ill effects of forced feeding in prison. Kitty, I couldn't find the details, but I know she was imprisoned at some point, and she received the Hunger Strike Medal of Valour, as her sister Annie did. But in 1916, Kitty and Jenny, they emigrated together to America and became joint head teachers of a school in New York, worked there till 1929, then moved to Philadelphia, moved to California, continued to teach together, very sweet. Kitty died in 1952 and Jenny died in 1961, both in California. But we're not done yet. We have Sarah Kenny, known as Nellie. Yeah, and it's like, I'm going to write it on here. So, born in 1876, so she was an active suffragette. She was arrested, she was imprisoned in 1907 due to her activism. However, in 1908 she married and emigrated to Montreal with her husband, where she focused on raising her family, and that's where she died in 1953. And I think it's absolutely fantastic, all those fascinating women, but I really wanted to highlight, taking nothing away from Annie Kenny, but that she's got these four sisters who are also there fighting the cause as well. And I think it's fantastic that I've been able to share their stories as well. Even the names weren't straightforward. Okay. So, just going to finish up then with a few of the interesting bits and pieces that I found when I was doing my research, because I had to do. Why do we vote on Thursdays? Anybody know what? You're not allowed to answer this. Does anybody know why we vote on Thursdays?
Yeah.
Well, you do, because I've done this talk
Yeah,
with you.
exactly.
It hasn't always been the case that elections have been held on Thursdays, or even that they were held on the same day, irrespective of what day of the week it was. Until 1918, each constituency, hello, Colin Rees, held their vote on whatever day they wanted. So voting could and did take place on more than one day. So it could take quite a few days to actually have the voting start and finish. But an act in 1918 made it law that irrespective of the day, all voting had to take place on the same day. So they would call it on July the 4th, whatever day that was, all voting had to take place on that day. But it wasn't set in law, it was a Thursday. This did, however, kind of just become the custom. And there were some years where voting in a general election did take place on a different day, 1918, 1922, 1924, 1931. But the last voting in a general election that didn't take place on a Thursday was in 1931, when everyone voted on Tuesday. Tuesday was selected. So all general elections and by-elections, local elections, since that date have taken place on a Thursday, with one exception. The Scottish town of Hamilton, in 1978, had a by-election which took place on a Wednesday, for a really important reason. The following day, the Thursday, was the start of the 1978 World Cup. So they wanted to make sure, in Argentina, they wanted to make sure no one missed kick-off on the opening match. That is fact. That is fact. And so the custom for voting on Thursdays is merely that. It is a custom. To this day, it's not set in stone. It's not enshrined in law that it is on a Thursday. So there's no reason, that, I'm telling you, if we thought that England were going to get to a World Cup final and there was going to be a general election and that was on a Thursday, I'm pretty sure we'd be voting on the Wednesday. Or maybe on the Friday. Oh,
No,
too many
we'll be on
hangovers.
Friday.
Too many hangovers.
No, because what's called Muslims go to mosque on Friday.
Alright.
Think about it.
We'll keep it on
Sunday.
Thursdays then. We'll keep it on Thursdays. But why did Thursday get settled on, even if only by custom? And there are many arguments as to the reason for this. So historically, Friday was payday, and people may have been too busy doing more fun things with their weekly salary than going to the voting, well, to go and vote. I'll vote for him. I've had a few, go on then, I'll vote for him instead. But that is another argument that's put forward, because Friday was also a half day for a lot of working people, and a lot of them went to the pub. So I've been a bit easily swayed after a few pints. And so some people argue, some historians argue, this is a reason enough for voting to take place the day before. You've got a bit of beer inside you, you might be like, I'll vote for whoever you want, you know? And authorities obviously wanted to make sure nobody was unduly influenced in their voting. And Sundays were avoided because of sermons from the pulpit on a Sunday morning. And they wanted to avoid the congregation being fired up by whichever way their local priest was voting. So a nice midweek day avoids any sway from pub or pulpit. And additionally, Thursdays have traditionally been market days in a lot of towns. So if people were going to the local town anyway to do shopping on market day, it made sense for them to be able to then go and vote rather than having to make another journey, avoiding a bit of voter apathy. So there have been quite a few sort of discussions or arguments over the years about moving election day to a weekend, about whether this would increase voter turnout. And so in 2010, the Ministry of Justice launched a public consultation with regards to just this. Should we move the actual voting day to the weekend? Would it make it more convenient? Would more people vote? And the answer was an overwhelming no. People were like, no, not interested, got more fun things to do at the weekend. So the majority of people favoured keeping it as it is, so any plans to change it currently shelved. Okay, so I've talked about the fantastic women fighting for women's suffrage. In the UK, this was finally successful to a degree in 1918. So there was a limited right given to some women to vote, but it only came about because the voting system was reviewed in 1916 and 1917 because men were being affected and being unable to vote. And we couldn't have that because in 1916, 1917, we were in the Great War. So men had to be over 21, they had to this, that and the other, but one of the crucial requirements is they had to have lived in the country for 12 months prior to voting taking place. And obviously with servicemen, they were either abroad or they had been abroad, so an awful lot of men were disenfranchised. And, powers that be weren't happy with that. Can't leave men out of the vote, my goodness, no. So it was reviewed, and so that residency requirement was taken away, and then some suffrage was given to women, basically women over the age of 30 who owned property. And it gave about 8.5 million women to vote. So, I mean, I'm being a little bit silly, but it was a massive step forward for the first time women are able to vote in general elections. But it was still different to men's requirements. They didn't have to be landowners, they didn't have to be over the age of 30. So some suffrages has been obtained, but equality hasn't. That happened in 1928 with the Equal Franchise Act, which finally granted the vote to women on the same basis as men. All women over the age of 21, and this now allowed around 50 million women in the country to vote. It was the Representation of the People Act of 1969 that lowered the voting age to 18. And there's quite often talk at elections about reducing the voting age to 16. I'm not sure if that's necessarily going to happen anytime soon, because I was really disappeared down these rabbit holes, and I was reading some statistics that basically say the younger you are, the less likely you are to actually vote. And then the statistics that say if you don't vote when you're younger, you're less likely to vote when you're older. So, don't know if they're going to do that. However, the Isle of Man, this always confuses me because it's part of the British Isles, but it's not part of the UK. I'm not a geographer. Very clear about that. They lowered the voting age to residents to the age of 16 in 2006, and it's the first country in Western Europe to do that. And the Isle of Man, they gave some votes to women in 1881, influenced by Lydia Becker. Okay, so she visited the island in 1880 and gave a series of talks about extending voting rights to women. Lots of women in the audience liking that idea. Yes, please, we'll have some of that. And there was a reformist politician called Richard Sherwood. He also liked the idea, and I love this. He argued that basically all the legislation on the island regarding voting should just remove the word man. Just remove it. Let's open it up to absolutely everybody. In his opinion, there were many women who were more deserving of enfranchisement than many of the men he knew. However, this was a touch too radical. For the Islands Council, they did make an amendment that allowed women to vote, but restricted it to spinsters and widows who owned property in their own right, and they didn't extend votes to all women until 1919. So the UK finally got there in the 20th century. There were some countries worldwide that allowed women to vote in some elections as early as the 17th century. In Friesland, part of the Netherlands, female landowners could vote in rural areas from 1689. And in some countries, sometimes there were loopholes that accidentally allowed women to vote. Remember Lily Maxwell, our Manchester shopkeeper, accidentally put on the electoral roll. So in Australia, in Victoria, the 1863 Electoral Act accidentally, I think through the wording, allowed some women to vote. Possibly something like, anyone over the age of who went or whatever. They didn't specify it had to be men. So when women realised this the following year, straight down to the elections and they voted. However, the following year, the Act was corrected to make sure women couldn't vote. New Zealand was the first country in the world to give full female suffrage in 1893, and I read a brilliant anecdote online that said that female suffrage would have been given earlier, but male politicians were worried that women would use their vote to ban alcohol. I don't know if that's true. I love it. I hope it is true. No, I'm not going to attempt accents again. I don't know where I was going. Even I was like, that's not going to end well.
Yeah, you would be one of them, or people like that, wouldn't you?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh yes, I'd be like, absolutely, ban bit. No, what
Well,
am I
you know
talking
what
about?
your name is on my form, don't you?
Yeah, Jim, is it Jim?
Jim Keller.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about that. Yes, I would not be banning alcohol. I'd be like, more please. And not to get political, not to get overly serious, obviously there are still some countries in the world that don't allow women to have the vote. The last country in Europe to give women full suffrage was Liechtenstein. When do you think that was? The last country in Europe to give full enfranchisement to women? What year do you reckon? 1960?
Or 80.
84?
Yeah.
1984. And there was a Swiss state of Oldham that didn't give full women suffrage until 1990. The Vatican City, world's smallest, or one of the world's smallest countries, oh no, it's the world's smallest country, still women can't vote. But that's kind of because it's not a democracy, it's an absolute monarchy run by the Pope. So the only person that gets voted for really is the Pope. Only cardinals can vote for the Pope, only men can be cardinals. So any women living in the country of the Vatican City have zero say. But I know that they have been reviewing whether women can be cardinals, but we shall see. So I'm just going to finish tonight's talk with just briefly on a few women's political firsts. So the first female Member of Parliament worldwide was Anna Rogstad of Norway. She was elected into office in 1911. The first female MP in Great Britain was an American-born lady called Nancy Astor. I like the cut of her gin. She moved to England after her divorce in 1906, and she married the massively wealthy Waldorf Astor. He was American-born from the very famous Astor family of New York. Now Waldorf, he was elected as MP for Plymouth in 1910. In 1919, his father died. He became the second Viscount Astor, and he took his seat in the House of Lords, which meant he had to give up his seat in the House of Commons. So they kind of stood around the London Order and, who do we get to replace you? And his wife. She was a very capable woman, quite formidable, but there was concern that she was, quote, too glamorous, too sharp-tongued, too divorced. But she stood in November that year and she won with a majority of 5,000 people, 5,000 votes. So clearly, the glamour, the sharpness of tongue, and the divorce didn't count against her. So she sat as an MP until 1945 as a member of the Conservative Party, originally the Unionist Party. Now, although she served as an MP for 26 years, she was never a member of the Cabinet, so she was a bit too sharp-tongued and divorced. But the first female MP to be a Cabinet member was Margaret Bondfield, member of the Labour Party, and she became Minister of Labour in 1929. And since 1918, there have been a total of 564 female MPs in the UK. And I'm sure all of us in this room are aware of Margaret Thatcher. Very divisive figure, I'm aware. She was the first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1979 to 1990, heading up the Conservative Party. And, you know, she, like I said, I know, maybe not necessarily the most popular of people, but she does deserve to be recognised for her achievement. She was the first female Prime Minister in the UK, and she was also the longest serving Prime Minister of the 20th century. The first female Prime Minister worldwide was Sirimavo Bandaranaike. She was elected Prime Minister of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, in July 1960. And so I'll just finish with one last note. So there are currently 226 female members of Parliament. Well, this was as of end of last year. I'm pretty sure we didn't have a general election, so, but essentially, 226 female members of Parliament, 387 male members of Parliament. However, there are currently over 1 million more women in the UK than men. So as far as I'm concerned, the time is right for those tables to be turned. Men be afraid, be very afraid. And that's it. Thank you very much.